echo many of the others who have said, what a pleasure it is to be here and to be back here after 4 years. We finally get to travel again. So I was given a rather daunting assignment by Long and Songwoo and others, which was to kind of pontificate on platform futures. And at some level, I think our last 2 days of the conference have been exactly on that. So although we've talked about changes in work and AI and AI and AI, fintech, Web3, the dangers of false information, and data, I want to drill down a little bit on some of the things where I see this notion of platform as a new organizational entity that can really do some good around some of the most fundamental challenges that we're facing. And I think Patrick and that session really laid some of that out, particularly with respect to climate change. So I'm going to focus on B2B platforms as part of that transition. And then I want to talk a little bit about data and forces of deglobalization. We've heard some positive, but to be honest, some of the things that are going on are troubling, and I think this community needs to kind of weigh in and be part of that conversation. And in many ways, Jacques kind of set that conversation up. One of the challenges that we see in the SMEs, in the industrial sector, is really one of implementation. I mean, we've seen the growth of these cloud technology firms. We've got kind of all of this software and platforms as service and AI on demand. But in reality, much of the economy is still doing something else, operating somewhere else, and very linear. And if we're going to take advantage of some of these tools, there's this big translation and implementation that needs to take place. And in many ways, I've spent a lot of my time over the last several years really trying to work with firms on implementing platforms, and I often discover that there's a first step, which is this digital transformation and digitalization. They often struggle, that is, incumbent firms, just with critical first principles. What is the exact problem digitalization is there to solve? For whom? How? And what are the metrics? And often you'll have quite a bit of divergence between your chief financial officer, who has a very kind of risk view with very well-defined probability functions on sort of benefits and costs, and the reality of experimentation and optionality that a lot of this technology creates. And of course, technical debt and some of the other issues. So to try to get my arms around this, I go and talk to a lot of people, frankly. For the last few years, I've really been trying to address this question that gets asked of Marshall, me, and others in the platform community, which is, look, you guys wrote a lot about pricing in two-sided networks. You've written a lot about the monetization models. You've written about a lot of things that you learned from consumer-facing systems. Where are we? Where are we in these stories? And so I've been collecting stories now for several years. Some of that comes from just assembling a database. My friend Peter Evans taught me that trick that says, if you want to learn about a thing, go try to figure out what's a cat, what's a dog, what's an elephant, put them into some categories. In the B2B side, there really wasn't much going on during the growth of B2C, but then that started to come on pretty strong around 2009, and then a lot in the kind of 2018 category. Now, to be clear, this is not a comprehensive data set. This is pretty US oriented. It would thrill me to no end to collect more data from Asia to add into that. One of the things that we have seen is this concern about no competition at the kind of platform provider level. That doesn't appear to be the case in these more specialized B2B platforms. Most of the firms that we've spoken with feel like they're in quite contested markets as you speak to them directly. To give you some idea of use cases, I'll just drill in on a couple. We had an example earlier on precision farming, which is really interesting. It turns out that a lot of the end users are relatively unsophisticated farmers, and the way that the platform embeds itself on those farms is to provide regulatory data collection. Because especially in the EU, you have to know how much fertilizer you lay down, what the seeds are, you have to be able to track that back. That's an expensive proposition, kind of perfect for a platform to come in, provide those tracking services, and then spit that back as something you could actually submit to a regulatory authority. Another one that's very interesting is this manufacturing data analytics and benchmarking. Turns out most systems in a manufacturing site have a kind of a panoply of data that's coming from all kinds of different machines. And you might think that's a relatively simple problem, but it turns out to be a hard one. The reason it's hard is that the equipment can be decades old. It will generate information that's not well tagged, and people no longer remember what half of it means. And so you actually end up with a fairly large AI exercise simply to take the tags that you do know to infer what you don't so that you can then ingest the data and have nicely organized data sets to do the things that we want to do around productivity improvement, quality improvement, and the like. We then did a survey to try to get a little bit more numerical data. And one of the things that was interesting to us was to see that by and large, most of these systems don't launch the way that you might think of a marketplace in the B2C where you try to have a big bang, and we're going to mobilize a lot of supply, we're going to mobilize a lot of demand, and then we'll have a VC company, and they'll have every incentive to try to blow us up as quickly as possible. 9 out of 10 will fail. The company doesn't much care because they'll monetize on that 10th. On the B2C side, we see a completely different pattern. To use, again, a friend's language, it's kind of hand-to-hand combat to get individual users onto the system to show value. And that value has to be independent of the other users. And so it looks very much like an enterprise software play, with the difference that these systems have to be engineered, or at least if you're going to capture the benefits of platforms, they have to be engineered so that you could encourage an ecosystem to come in, and you don't start out of the gates with the technical debt that then says that you have to refactor everything as soon as you do want to open it up for additional value. And then a friend and founder and CEO of one of these companies said, look, it takes much longer to get network effects, and it's much harder in B2C. And this particular CEO was chief counsel for some of the largest firms you've heard of, and worked in marketplaces like eBay and senior leadership, so knows exactly what network effects are and how they work, and pivoted over into an industrial sector and said, look, but when they do occur, it's very hard to be dislodged, much in the way that Jacques was talking about in terms of the switching costs. I just tossed this in, which is why it's slightly fuzzy, but I had to react to the session this morning because we were talking about the benefits and some of the differential assumptions in who should own data, who should be able to use data. What's interesting is that in the 200 firms that we've been collecting information from, it's a very different philosophy. They basically say, look, even of the data of the participants' inputs, the platform operator still takes ownership and they don't share it. In terms of the transaction data, the platform owners are not sharing data with 65%. So that's surprising because that goes really counter to what we've been talking about philosophically, and I think Long did a tremendous job of kind of laying out sort of the benefits, the reuse, and why philosophically this should be a shared resource. There's a lot of work to do out there in sort of the world of industrial systems and implementation. And so I think conversations like ours need to percolate further down the system. In terms of the B2B and B2C, we've seen really different monetization patterns. So again, much of what we theorized about, and when Marshall and I got going on two-sided networks, we generated 30, 40 examples. I think I still have the piece of paper. Might have been 1999, right there at the beginning of when this two-sided market literature was getting going. And our question was, why is so much stuff for free? Because we were looking at these subsidy models that had a logic because you were internalizing externalities. And so the B2C platforms tended to monetize through some sort of a transaction cut from one side. We see a completely different pattern on the B2C side, or rather the B2B side. We see this launch as software as a service, and then we see them reinforcing that model as they grow and get a user base, but not necessarily monetizing. Over a third of our sample on the surveys charged nobody. And here are a couple of examples. Peter mentioned Metals Hub yesterday. We interviewed the whole senior leadership team, and they had to pivot. They tried taking transaction cuts, and that failed because these are 10, 15, $20 million transactions, and even at 0.5% or smaller, it was in their interest to do the usual thing, which is to disintermediate, take the transactions off platform. So they had to pivot back to becoming an information service provider simply to demonstrate the value of the system, and yet they're still running a market, so they're still a platform. It's just that they're not monetizing it directly. And you see this pattern again in HubSpot. So that's a CRM system. I asked the fellow who set up their platform, and I said, great, what's your transaction cut? He said, 0, we don't. I said, okay, why? He said, because we're a subscription recurring revenue business. We increase our value by increasing retention. If we run a platform, do a bunch of integrations, retention goes through the roof, and then we upsell in terms of the usage. By the way, that's a lot of what the platform providers will end up doing when working with these B2B service providers on top of them, and they'll be monetizing in similar ways. In terms of the problems that they're solving, we really see a couple of different ones. Again, if Al were here, we'd be talking about kind of market design and worrying about thickness and congestion and safety. And these are things that the B2C platforms came into the fore and were able to solve around market failure. B2B has a different issue. You often know all the market participants. It's just that the coordination cost of integrating is really hard if it's going to be bilateral. It makes much more sense to engineer N-to-1 as opposed to N-to-N minus 1. And so that's the logic that these systems use. And so you have a different sort of fundamental problem that the two systems are solving. Now I'm going to pivot slightly for just a couple of minutes, because if we think about the value of data and the way that we're creating value from data, it's really troubling that we've seen over the last several years, and the previous US administration kind of kicked some of this off. COVID certainly didn't help, but there are lots of actors that are driving a couple of things on the digital and physical decoupling. That has the potential to destroy value. And so if you kind of buy that data has a learning curve, if you start fragmenting these systems before they're way out on the learning curve, you end up having the potential of real problems here. You've got this sort of value destruction. That can happen in two ways. It can happen simply from regulation. It can happen from blocking access. And so you've got a couple of ways that you might feel that. If you're in a diminished returns and you're operating in only one jurisdiction, you're probably fine. If you're in one of these sort of side blocks where you're in many jurisdictions, but you've already hit diminishing returns, then you're exposed to potential regulation, destroying value. If you're within just a few jurisdictions, but there's still a lot of performance improvement possible, now you've got a competition challenge. And if you're in the lower right, you have a big challenge. And I would argue that many of the ways that we're talking about harnessing generative AI, the pre-trained models, are down there in the lower right. And so what I'm going to do is kind of zip forward a bit, not too far, and just talk about some of the forces. We've got industrial policies, we've got limitations to market access, we've got data policies, all of which are potentially making it harder to capture the benefits of shared data, rather than easier. And I think, again, I'll look at Long and say I think he was really eloquent on the notion that these are new economic forms. And then the last panel that we heard on data was there are pretty different views on who owns data and for what purpose, and the idea that maybe these are resources that really do need to be made available to all because so much value can be captured. So with that, thank you.